Soggy bottoms, cracked crusts, tough and chewy? We're talking about pies this week, y'all. In this video, I'm going to be teaching you the basics of pie making, what crust to use, what kind of pan to use, how to avoid those soggy bottoms and cracked crusts, how to flute and make a lattice texture. Basically, all the info you need to make the best pie ever. The first thing we need to understand is that pie dough comes in two forms. We have mealy dough and flaky dough. What's the difference and why does it matter? When I was researching pie crust recipes, I noticed that most people just say a pie crust recipe. And in pastry school, we made two different kinds of pie crusts, the mealy and the flaky. And I was confused as to why this was never addressed. So a mealy dough is made with butter and flour, egg, cold water, salt, and it's not really anything amazing when it comes to ingredients, but the mixing method is where you take the flour and the butter and you mix it while it's cold, and it makes this mealy texture. It looks like cornmeal. So even though mealy dough sounds kind of weird, that's what they're referring to, is that mealy texture. And what you're actually doing is you're coating all the flour with that butter, so it's making it very short, like shortbread. So if you think about a butter cookie, when you bite into it, it's crisp, but it like melts in your mouth. So what a mealy dough is basically a short crust. And short crust is made basically with very small pieces of butter that creates a very dense dough that repels liquids, like in pie. So if you're making a pie that has a lot of liquids like pumpkin pie or apple pie, and you need to make sure you're not getting that soggy bottom, you're gonna wanna use a mealy dough. So that's the number one problem that you guys have said that you have with pies, is that soggy, unbaked bottom. So why don't you use mealy dough for all pie crust? Well, it doesn't look very nice. You don't need to see mealy dough when it's on the bottom of the pie pan. You just need it to bake up really crisp and repel that liquid. But when we're talking about the top layer of a pie, you want to use flaky pie dough. Flaky pie dough has big chunks of butter, no egg, no sugar, a little bit of salt, but that's it. So you can either make small pieces of butter and kind of squish them between your fingers, or you can use my trick of grating butter directly over the flour and then just toss the mixture till the flour coats the butter. Then you add in just enough water, about 2 ounces, to get it to stick together. Do not knead it, do not mix it, do not try to make it cohesive. We basically just want these butter chunks to be stuck together with a little bit of flour. When you roll out flaky pie dough, you should see big chunks of butter actually visible in your pie dough. And what happens is when it bakes up, those layers of butter melt, the water in the butter evaporates, and it creates steam, and that makes those flaky layers, which is beautiful and looks gorgeous on the top layer. But because the layers of butter are kind of far apart and in between them it's just flour, that's not good for using at the bottom of your pie crust. The liquid is gonna find those little pockets where the butter isn't and just soak right into the flour, and that's where we get soggy bottoms. Ugh. So, mealy dough for the bottom of your pies, flaky dough for the top of your pies. Easy, right? Smush it all together, wrap it tightly with some plastic wrap, and leave that in the fridge for at least an hour or overnight. It's nice to actually just prep a bunch of pie dough and keep it in the fridge when you're making tons of pies, or you can even prep your pie dough, put it in the pie pans and freeze it. So you're like, oh, I wanna make a pie. I'll just go grab one of my frozen doughs and use it. Kind of like, you know, when you go to the store and you buy a frozen pie crust, that's all it is. Now let's talk about the different types of pies. We've got single crust pies, double crust pies, and no bake pies. So we have our one crust pies where you actually bake the crust with the filling like pumpkin pie. The pie dough bakes with the filling, in this case like a custard. That's one type of pie. Another type of pie is like a double crust pie, where you not only have a pie crust on the bottom, but you have a pie crust on the top, like apple pie. You can do like one layer of pie crust on top, or you can do a lattice pie. Doesn't matter which one, it's still kind of a double crust. But you're still gonna wanna use a mealy dough for the bottom and a flaky dough for the top. The third type of pie is a no-bake pie. This is where you blind bake the crust before you put in the cooked filling, like a halpia pie, chocolate peanut butter pie, or banana cream pie. So I'm going to be showing you the basics of making each of these pies and how to roll out the crust. For the fillings, you want to check out my recipes on sugargeekshow.com. So when you first take your pie dough out of the fridge, it's a little bit hard. So you want to take it out maybe 20 minutes before you actually need it to give the butter a little bit of time to start softening, but you don't want it to be soft. And this one is going to be for our pumpkin pie. So it's my mealy pie dough. The deal with butter is that when it's room temperature, it's soft enough that you can impress with your finger, and when it's cold, it's like hard as a rock. But when it's in that middle ground, it becomes like sort of elastic. And this butter stage is actually what you use to make things like croissants and puff pastry and stuff like that. So it's like that perfect temperature. Don't let this scare you though. I'm gonna show you exactly what to do. When it comes to baking up pies, especially pies that have liquid in them, it's best to actually use a metal pie pan. It's totally okay to use glass and to use ceramic, but metal is going to create the crispest layer. So it's going to be like extra insurance to make sure you don't have that soggy bottom. You can even use those like disposable aluminum pans. All right, so when we first start rolling out our pie dough, got our layer of flour down, and you want to put a little bit of flour on your rolling pin. Keep it from sticking. And you can actually roll this out between two pieces of parchment paper. That makes it a little bit easier to handle, but I'm just doing this straight on the table. This is still too hard. Okay. And to roll it out, we want to basically start in the center, like all of your pressure is in the center here, and you're going to make little movements. Give it a little wiggle to get it going. And we're gonna rotate and just keep doing that until it's all rolled out. We're shooting for about 1/8 of an inch thick. You don't want to make your pie dough too thick because then it's going to be really tough when you eat it. And the faster you can do this part, the easier it's going to be to handle and lift up into your pie plate. If you have sticking, you can use a bench scraper or even a credit card, if that's all you had, just to kind of lift it away from the table. Move, 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 keep it moving. Just pinching together any spots where it kind of breaks, that's totally fine. And then you can roll this up onto your rolling pin, or you can fold it in half and then fold it in quarters, whatever works for you and is easiest. Bring our pie plate over, just unroll into the pie plate. Press that down in there. You want your pie dough to be about 12 inches in diameter to account for the width and the depth of the pie plate. All right, now we're going to trim, leave a little extra all the way around. If you have any thin spots, I definitely recommend kind of building those up with extra pie dough, otherwise it's gonna break when you go to cut it. I'm not a great crust fluter, but basically you just take your thumb and you push the pie crust over your thumb, and then you go up, and then push, up, push. That's about as fancy as I get. You can also use a fork where you just kind of indent all the way around. So now as we're rolling out our pie crust, we have activated the gluten, and the pie crust is going to want to like shrink down even more because it's all stretchy. We were just handling it, and all of those glutens in the flour are like super active. So we want to put this back into the freezer, and we want to freeze it for 20 minutes. And what this does is it hardens the butter back up, and it also gives a chance for those glutens to relax. All right, our pie is nice and frozen. I put it onto a quarter sheet cookie sheet, just like a small one. And I'm just gonna fill this all the way up. You're like, oh my gosh, Liz, that's a lot of batter. But pumpkin pie is actually just like creme brulee or cheesecake. It doesn't rise at all. It just stays where it's at. So get all of that good pumpkin stuff into the pie. Egg wash. 1 egg white with about a teaspoon of water, just to thin it out a little bit. Whisk it up. We're gonna brush this over the edges of our pie dough. If you don't use an egg wash, your pie crust won't brown. You don't have to soak it, and you don't want to get any egg wash on the underside of your crust between the crust and the pie pan, because otherwise it'll be like glue and it will glue it to the pie pan. Not what we're going for. All right, this is going into our oven at 375 degrees for about 30 to 40 minutes until when you tap the side, the center is set and isn't jiggling. I have my oven rack set to almost the very bottom of the oven, and then I have the other rack at the very top so that if things start browning too much, I can put a sheet pan on there and kind of protect my pie from getting too brown. Okay, our pumpkin pie is done. I can tell because there's just a very, very slight wiggle in the middle, but it's not like soupy. That's how you test. I have a couple of cracks around the edges because I made it a little bit too thin. So just be aware, that's what causes that. Now all that's left to do for this guy is to let it cool down. All right, time for our double crust. I'm gonna go ahead and roll out my mealy pie dough. I'm using a ceramic pie dish this time because I only have 2 metal pie pans, but you could also use a glass pan. Apple pie is one of those pies that I do feel like it's like you want it to be deep dish, right? My arms are getting so tired. All right, roll into our pie plate. Definitely did not do that very good, but it's fine. Close up any cracks and stuff that are in there. Make sure it's pressed all the way up against the edges. Trim off the excess, leaving that 1/4 inch around the outside. And then you guessed it, back into the fridge. Keep it nice and cold. All right, time to finish our apple pie. My filling's cooled down, and I'm just gonna scoop that up and put it in there. You really wanna make sure your filling is cool, otherwise it's gonna melt that butter. We don't want that. When you pre-cook the apples, you don't have to worry about stuff like, oh, make sure your apples are layered really snugly, and make sure there's not too much liquid in there. Like it's all the way that it's supposed to be. So it's not gonna settle. You can just decorate it and know that it's gonna look beautiful. All right, I'm gonna set that aside. Get my flour back, my rolling pin, and my knife, and my pie crust, which has been sitting out. And then I put it back in the fridge to make sure it wasn't getting too soft. Start rolling that out. I'm gonna do a lattice because why not? I think it'll look gorgeous. It's the holidays, time to get fancy, right? But you could just do 1 pie crust if you want, just by rolling out 1 big sheet, laying it over the top, and then just cut a couple of vents to make sure that the steam from the apples has a way to escape. If you don't have those vents, then your top crust will end up splitting around the edges, basically having a pie explosion, because that steam needs to get out somehow. So to make a lattice, I'm just gonna roll out, just like I was gonna be rolling it out to put on top, and then I'm just gonna cut it into strips. Try and work quickly so your butter doesn't get too soft. You can see all the lovely little patches of butter in there that I know is gonna result in nice flaky layers. Also, don't forget, you wanna egg wash the edges of your pie crust so that your top crust and your bottom crust makes a nice fusion. If you don't put egg wash on there or water or something, it's just gonna split apart. Now we're gonna cut about, I would say 1/2 inch pieces. Scoot that off to the side. All right, time to make lattice. We're just going to place 1 over the center. Leave a little bit of space in between each piece. Like so. And then I'm just going to press down pretty firmly on the ends here. Make a nice connection. And then every other one, gonna lift up gently and just fold that over. This one I probably don't need to. The first one's kind of short, so. Press that end down, press this end down, and then fold it back up. And we're just gonna repeat. So now I'm gonna go to this one, every other one. Definitely don't trim your dough pieces until you're done weaving the lattice, because it ends up being shorter because of the weaving. So if you trim it too soon, then you won't have enough dough. Ask me how I know that one. Made that mistake before. Okay, once you have everything woven, you can go ahead and trim off the excess bits. All right, now I'm gonna put a nice egg wash over the top so that it browns. And then I'm going to sprinkle some sanding sugar over the top, because that just creates a nice texture and a little bit extra crunch, which I think tastes really good with the, the apple pie. All right, now we're gonna put this in the oven. Just kidding, we're gonna put it back in the fridge. You have to keep it chilled. Remember, pie doesn't like to be warm. I'm gonna put this guy onto a cookie sheet so that it's easier to handle. So back into the fridge for 20 minutes, and then we will bake in the oven. So now I'm gonna go ahead and make my single crust, no bake pie. So for that, I'm gonna use my flaky crust, because I want that crust to just melt in my mouth and be super tender. And because the filling is not baked, I can use my flaky crust. So this is my flaky crust dough, half of one recipe, and it's been sitting out for 20 minutes. You can already see these little chunks of butter in there, and that's gonna create the flakes. Kind of shape it more into a circle. Little movements, rotate often, push together any cracks that form. If it starts sticking to your rolling pin, just put some flour on your rolling pin, not on your dough. I'm literally just gonna take a piece of this and move it over here. A little bit bigger. Again, you wanna try and work quickly so that it's not sticking and that you're not working that butter into the flour. You wanna keep those layers of butter intact. Honestly, I think when you're making pie, the most important thing to do is just give yourself permission that it might not be perfect. Like, everything takes practice, right? I'm a cake decorator, and my first cake looked terrible, so you shouldn't expect your first pie to be like spectacular. It's still gonna taste good, right? We're gonna roll that up. The cracks, no big deal. Bring in our pie plate. Unroll. All right, we're gonna trim off the excess, but leave a little bit around the outside to allow for shrinking. Just kind of pushing those ends in so they're not so ragged, right? And then I'm gonna go ahead and pinch, form that nice edge. If you ever feel like your pie crust is getting too hard to handle, just put it back in the fridge or the freezer. There's no reason why you have to try and rush through and struggle with it sticking and being too soft. Just put it back in the fridge. When we make croissants from scratch, there's a lot of in and out of the fridge to keep the butter at the right temperature. Then we're gonna take a fork and just poke. You don't need a ton. This is gonna be some vents so that the air that's trapped underneath the pie doesn't cause the crust to puff up. And since we're gonna bake this without any filling in it, this helps it stay up against the pie pan. All right, so now we want to bake this in the oven, but first we want to freeze it because I've been handling it, it's super soft, so I don't wanna be putting like pie weights and stuff in here yet because it will ruin the crust. So into the freezer for 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, blind baking. My pie crust is nice and frozen. I'm gonna take a piece of aluminum foil, place that on top. It's not gonna mess up the pie crust because it's frozen. You can also use parchment paper. I, for some reason, just feel like the aluminum foil does a better job. I don't know why. Pie weights or dried beans in there. And we're gonna bake that for 15 minutes. Give it enough time to kind of set. I'm also going to put this on top of a pan just so it's easier to take out of the oven and I don't damage my crust. Okay, so it's been 15 minutes. I'm going to carefully pull the tin foil up and then back into the oven until it's nicely brown and it's pulling away from the edges. Our par baked crust is done. You can see that this is super freaking fluffy. Like, it's shrunk down just a little bit, which is totally normal. You can see it's shrunk down from the edges just a tiny bit. I have just a couple little tiny cracks from where it was a little bit too thin. Totally okay, but you can just see it's gonna like melt in my mouth, be super flaky and buttery. My mouth is watering. So I'm gonna let this cool down before I fill it with my chocolate and coconut filling and top it with some stabilized whipped cream. So I'm gonna put my coconut filling in here. And I wanna put this into the freezer until it's set. That's how you keep your layers separate. All right, our Halpia layer, coconut, has set up. All right, and then we're gonna pour the chocolate layer on top. Oh, I tend to have more chocolate than coconut. Spread that out, and then you guessed it, back into the fridge to chill. I'm gonna let this one chill overnight and then top it with some whipped cream before serving. Stabilized whipped cream. I've already eaten like 3 pieces of pie, but what's one more piece? This is the Halpia pie with the par-baked crust, still nice and crunchy. I'm so perfect. That crunch with the creaminess of the pie. I could seriously eat this all day. I might. So in conclusion, making pie really is easy as pie, but those who know say it's all about the dough. Yes, I just said that and I spent a lot of time thinking about that, so please appreciate it. If you want to learn more about baking in videos like this one, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'm Liz Merrick and I'll see you guys next time. Bye! More pie! Give me more!